Hello and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk about ocean circulation. And the first component of circulation is going to be our wind-driven currents, right? So we're going to have the first of a multi-part conversation about ocean atmospheric connection, okay? So there are the big convection cells, the atmospheric convection cells. And at the equator, we know that we have lots of solar radiation coming in, and so we get very warm waters. That causes lots of evaporation. The warm, moist air rises until it hits the top of the troposphere, bottom of the stratosphere, right? Where we have that stratopause, which comes up a lot when we talk about stratospheric ozone, things like that. But back to this, right? Where warm, moist air is evaporating, there's lots and lots of evaporating. It is highly energetic. It goes all the way up. And then as it rises, it's going to cool. The moisture is going to condense, and you're going to get lots and lots of rain. That rain is going to fall down. And the funny thing, around the equator, you have lots of tropical rainforests. That makes sense. Now, once the air hits that atmospheric break, right, that stratopause, it's going to split, and some of it's going to travel north and some of it's going to travel south. And this is now very cold, dry air. As it moves, right, it's denser, and so it's going to begin to sink, right? And so as it sinks, it's going to approach the surface of the Earth, and it is going to heat up as it travels lower in the atmosphere. So by the time that it reaches the surface of the Earth, it is not only dry, it is hot. This is where you find deserts, right? Now, once it hits the Earth, it can't keep going down, so it's going to split. Some of it's going to go south, and some of it's going to go north, and so you'll get this nice little convection cell set up. Warm, moist air rising, condenses, rains out, it's dry now, moves north or south. It's denser, so it starts to sink. It warms up as it approaches. You get hot, dry air here. And then the same thing is going to happen, the same thing is going to happen as you travel north or south into the next set. That splitting air is going to warm and pick up moisture. As it does that, it's going to rise, and as it rises, it's going to complete a second cell. This is the equatorial region, or the equatorial cell, or the Hadley cells. These are the mid-latitudes, or the Ferrel cells, right? And you're going to have that same stratospheric split here. You're going to have nice big forests. These are your boreal forests because you have lots of rain or snow, as the case may be. And then you're going to have that same idea of that dry sinking air because it's more dense, and this is where you find polar deserts on the north and south. Okay, so there's a little bit about the large atmospheric cycles. Now, what that causes is winds. And so you get the air blowing, you get the trade winds around the equator, you get the westerlies in the mid-latitudes, and you get the easterlies in the polar regions, okay? That wind drags along the surface of the ocean. And so it pushes the water, and that water pushes the water underneath, and pushes the water underneath, and pushes the water underneath. But eventually, you don't actually have a whole lot of water pushing. So you get surface currents that flow, and you get a very nice big global current map that looks like this. And you'll notice that as the winds blow, right, first of all, there are continents in the way, and we'll talk about that in just a second. As the winds blow and they're dragging this water, it's going to run into these continents, and you start to get circular kinds of things. Now, there's a vertical system that also drives some of this, and we'll talk about that just in a second. But when looking at the surface currents, you see these very characteristic circular patterns. You can see that there are big currents. One that you're familiar with, of course, is the Gulf Stream. This takes warm water from the equator and it drags it up the coast of the United States all the way into the North Atlantic. This, by the way, is what keeps Northern Europe warmer than it actually should be if there were no current. And so this is the other really important thing about these surface currents. They distribute water from the hot equatorial regions up further north and further south, and so they help distribute energy throughout the ocean. But let's look at these gyre patterns. When we talk about marine debris and we talk about the garbage patches, they are occurring in these gyres because of the way the water currents sort of cycle, they will end up, and let me go back to that slide, dumping out anything that's floating in them into the centers of these gyres. Now the gyres also have a vertical component, like I said, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so surface circulation, gyres, right? Now, as the winds are blowing, right, you have winds blowing in different directions. Remember, you've got your trade winds and your westerlies, and so you've got this very interesting, like, we're blowing this way, we're blowing this way, and so the water is actually blowing away from itself, but here at the equator, it's converging, right? These two big circulation patterns are converging. Remember, this is where the air is rising and sinking, and so it's dragging the air, the air is dragging the water, and you get two phenomena, convergence, right, and divergence, which lead to downwelling and upwelling. So what do I mean by that? As the winds are pulling the waters apart, right, the waters will diverge, and that pulls water up from the depth, and so you get this horizontal to vertical connection. So as the surface waters sort of move away from each other, deep water upwells and replaces it. Now, in areas where the winds are coming together, they're pushing water together. This is called convergence, and it leads to downwelling. It forces that water to go down. And you can actually see this kind of idea when we were talking about the atmospheric cells, right? When the atmospheric cells, when those air masses collided at the surface, right, then they pushed upward. Well, in this case, the air pushes upward at the equator, right, and the water pushes downward, right? So this is convergence and divergence. So there's an interesting relationship between the upwelling and the downwelling, the gyres, and how nutrients and dissolved gases are distributed in the ocean. Okay, so we know that light drives photosynthesis. We also know that light does not travel deep into the ocean. We also know that CO2 is nearly always at saturation concentration, which means that there's lots of dissolved CO2 in the water. Okay, so these two things combined means that nutrients are the limiting factor right at the surface. And so all of these little photosynthesizers, they're using CO2, they're releasing oxygen, but they're going to use up the nutrients too. So the question becomes, where do nutrients come from? Well, they come from stuff that dies and decomposes, but stuff that dies and decomposes sinks to the bottom. So in order to get nutrients, we need upwelling. So places where you see upwelling, right, are places that have lots of nutrients. And so here's just an example. Here are sea surface temperatures. There's a lot of upwelling here off the coast of California, right? And so what you've got is this colder, deep water coming up. Now, interestingly enough, this brings cool water up to the surface, also helps mitigate temperatures and things like that. But the second picture, this is the one we want to talk about right now, this is chlorophyll, right? This is chlorophyll production. Where there are lots of nutrients, there is lots of chlorophyll. So it shows you that upwelling areas, even though they're small, they support huge fisheries. 50% of the world's fisheries are actually in upwelling zones. That's really important. So if we stopped having this upwelling, then we would not have good fisheries. Now, we're not going to stop having upwelling, right? Because it's driven by atmospheric currents and all of this good stuff, right? When you put it all together, you get what's called the ocean conveyor belt system. And so you've got warm water traveling and all through, right? And then you've got these deep cold currents that are driven by the surface currents, and you get a very large connected path. So we think of the ocean as just being this still water, but it's not. It's moving a lot. We've got all those surface currents, we've got microcurrents, and then we have this massive general conveyor belt system. Okay. Now, looking at this is that Gulf Stream. So here's my question. If the loop of water constantly moving through the oceans as a result of temperature differences were to slow or stop, what would happen? Europe would become much hotter, Europe would become much colder, northeastern North America would become much hotter, or North America would suffer floods and severe storms. This is an interesting question. So remember, I told you that Gulf Stream, right? If you were to do something to shut down that Gulf Stream, then you would stop warm water going to Europe, and Europe would become much colder. Okay, now in that question, I also mentioned density, right? When I was talking about hot water and cold water, I mentioned density. Okay, you didn't know it necessarily or weren't thinking about it, but warm water, just like warm air, is less dense, right? Cold water, just like cold air, is more dense. But the ocean has two density drivers. The first one being temperature, the second one being salinity. The more salt that you have in the water, the the more dense it is, okay? And so seasonal sea ice actually drives the formation of deep water currents. So what we're talking about, right, is the idea, what I've got here is this cold water sinks and it mixes and all this good stuff, right? But here we've got this idea of ice. Ice also increases the density of that cold water that's going to sink at the poles, because when ice freezes, it's like when water evaporates, it leaves salt behind. When ice freezes, it leaves salt behind. Okay, and so you get more dense water where there is ice, and this is the other driver. Sea ice is actually really important because of this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of these air-sea surface interactions that are not about movement. We want to talk about the carbon cycle, right? Atmospheric CO2 dissolves into the water, right? And this is great because it drives photosynthesis. What it also means is that the ocean is a huge carbon sink. And so as long as there is a robust population of phytoplankton, they can take in lots of CO2 to do photosynthesis with, right? And this produces lots of organic matter. It produces the potential for lots of nutrients, right? And the other important thing that's about the carbon is when it's dissolved in the water, it forms carbonate ions. This is really important because marine organisms, incorporate the carbonate. They can make bones with it, but also they can make shells. Shells are made out of calcium carbonate. And so you have a second carbon reservoir here. The water itself is a carbon reservoir, a carbon sink, but then all of the sea life that uses calcium carbonate can lock carbon up into its shells. When they die, they sink to the bottom. Sedimentation occurs, right? And eventually that sediment can become rock, right? Typically that rock is called limestone, which is sedimentary rock that's mostly calcium carbonate. So this is a really important function that oceans perform in the carbon cycle. Now, which of the following is a result of this gas exchange at the surface? Because they also dissolve oxygen, things like that. So do we have less dissolved oxygen at the surface, higher nitrogen levels, because the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, the formation of carbonic acid, or periodic fish kills? Well, let me just say there are periodic fish kills. That can happen for all kinds of reasons. The answer to this, because we're talking about carbon, is the formation of carbonic acid. By the way, there will never be less dissolved oxygen at the surface if you have photosynthesis going on, because photosynthesis produces oxygen. Okay, so the problem here is the formation of carbonic acid. And in the normal cycle, the formation of carbonic acid is not a big deal, right? CO2 is dissolved, it mixes with the water, hydrogen dissociates and forms carbonic acid. This is the equation for this, right? Now, here's the thing though, right? Those hydrogens that are formed when the carbonic acid is formed, these sort of like loose hydrogens, they will bond with the carbonate. So instead of animals being able to take in the carbonate, right, it forms bicarbonate. And this is not helpful, okay? And so there's not enough carbonate for the calcium carbonate formation in things like coral or mussels, and you get deformations, right, in those calcium carbonate structures. So not only do you get the formation of carbonic acid, which lowers the pH of the ocean, which could exceed certain species' ranges of tolerance and cause them to die, you also get a decrease in available carbonate to form structures for marine animals. So ocean acidification has two big problems, okay? Now, let's shift gears, and I want to go back to the idea of this wind and water interaction. Okay, so the last part of our conversation today is going to be about El Nino, right? And what we're talking about here is the interaction of the trade winds in the Pacific with the Pacific Ocean. And the whole phenomenon is actually called ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, and it describes three possible sort of wind-water conditions. One, there is normal, where the trade winds blow normally. There's two, El Nino, which is when the trade winds relax. And then the third one is La Nina, and this is when the trade winds go crazy. They blow extremely strong comparatively. La Nina is what we call enhanced normal, right? It's more than normal. So let's really analyze what this means. First of all, the normal structure, right, of everything, the normal system is that you have strong trade winds. They create strong equatorial currents. Those strong equatorial currents push water over here, right, to the western side of the Pacific. And so what that means is that you get low pressure and warm water piling up around Indonesia, Australia, right? And this results in the monsoon season, by the way. Okay. Now, on the eastern side of the Pacific, what you have is the upwelling of the Peruvian current. Now, this is really beneficial to the Peruvian economy, for instance, because upwelling brings all those great nutrients. We know that where you have upwelling, you have good fisheries. The Peruvian fishing industry is quite robust. As a matter of fact, they rely on it extremely heavily, right? So this is all normal. Peru is a fishing country. Okay, so we've got cool water, upwelling, strong equatorial currents blowing towards the west, warm water, and monsoon. That is normal. Okay, here's a picture of exactly what's happening here. And here's the vertical. See all that upwelling, and then you see all of that downwelling of the warm water. So that's a vertical cross section. You get that nice, cool water, warm water here. Storms, yay, okay? That's how it works. And when we start looking at sea surface temperatures, right, you can see warm, cold. And when we look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, those are variations from normal, right, variations from normal. You can see there's very little variation from normal because it's normal, right? Okay. Now, in some instances, you might get something that looks like this. This does not look like normal. This is what we call El Nino. Okay, now remember, in El Nino, the trade winds relax, and I would like to say at this point, the trade winds do not blow backwards. The trade winds do not blow backwards. They just relax. But when they relax, what that means is that they're not pushing that very strong equatorial current to the west. They relax, and then the water can actually flow backwards, right? Depends on how strong the El Nino is. Sometimes you just get less of a current. Sometimes you actually get this countercurrent that flows backwards. And sometimes it's a really strong countercurrent that comes back. But what that results in is warm water pooling here at Peru. You have dry conditions over here because there's higher pressure, right? And this warm water travels away, so you've actually got cooler water over here, and instead of this great upwelling that brings nutrients, you just have this warm water pooling here. See, the winds are still blowing in the same direction, they're just weaker, right? Strong countercurrent. Okay, this actually wreaks havoc on the Peruvian fishing season because there's not enough nutrients to supply the food chain. Now, interestingly enough, it also changes our weather. We get wetter weather here for us. You get warmer than average winters up north, and you get really cold, wet winters for us down here. Okay, and we'll be talking about that in class. All right, so just to put it all together, here is that vertical. You can see you do not have the upwelling. You can see you do not have the downwelling here, and you lose the monsoon, and it's still raining, right? Because there's still warm water and evaporation and stuff. It's just that it's raining in the middle of the ocean, and it's raining in Peru. Now, Peru is used to dry conditions during this time of year, right? And El Nino, La Nina normal, you start to see that cycle around September. Okay, okay? And then it will strengthen throughout the winter, and then usually by March, the phenomenon is over, right? So it's only part of the year. So during this time of year, it's called El Nino, by the way, because it occurs in the winter, and it's related to Christmas, El Nino, the boy child. So you have rain, flooding here in Peru, and you have drought where you should have monsoon. This causes all sorts of problems, things that go with drought and things that go with flooding. And so it's not normal for either of those places, and now they have to deal with these weather changes. Okay, so when we start looking at the sea surface temperature, you can see that band of warm all the way across the ocean, and you can see when you look at the anomaly chart that it is much warmer than usual here where it should have upwelling. Okay, and it's colder over here where you should have warmer. All right, and if you were to look at a really strong El Nino, you might see something that looks like this. This is 97 was a really, really strong El Nino, like really strong. Okay, it changed weather patterns all over the world, and El Nino and La Nina do change weather patterns globally. This one happened to make huge extreme changes, and so when you do just a general comparison, this is kind of what you're looking at. When you see warm water in this nice little hook, this means that you've got normal conditions. When you see a band of warm water that goes all the way to Peru, this is where you have El Nino conditions. Now, remember I told you there was a third one? That is La Nina, the girl child. This is enhanced normal. This is where the trade winds blow really strong, right? You get a reinforcement of normal conditions. They are more extreme wherever you are. So you get really big monsoon, right? Really dry, much colder water here, much more dry weather, not dry water. That doesn't make any sense. You get dry weather conditions, cooler water here, more upwelling, fishing boom. This is actually good for Peru. It's not bad. And you get much shallower thermocline here because there's all this cold water coming up. Okay, so when you look at it together, it looks just like El Nino, but more. So when we look at the sea surface temperature maps, you can see all that cold, and then when we look at the anomalies, you can see that cold water. And the January 2000 La Nina, also very strong. You can really see that marked cold water here. And when we compare, 99 also had a strong La Nina. So 97 to 99, you can see these extreme differences. And again, remember I told you that they do affect our weather. We get more extreme weather during El Nino, and we get more enhanced normal during La Nina. And this is something you'll be dealing with in your weather prediction. Okay, so how often do these occur? What's the pattern? Yeah. We don't really know. We don't really understand the pattern for La Nina and El Nino. We can map the patterns, but there's not really some predictable pattern. Okay, so here's your next question. El Nino events increase with current climate change patterns, true or false? Well, this is an interesting question, and the answer to it is that we don't know. It's not true and it's not false because we don't know. We don't understand why the oscillation occurs, and we don't understand the pattern, and so we cannot tell if it's linked to climate change in any way. And that's kind of an interesting thing about the statement that in science, we can't make stuff up. We can only say what we have evidence for, and people have lots of feelings about this, and feelings are not the truth, right? We don't have any evidence, so we don't know, so we can't say. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know in class. I will see you next time, and thanks for listening.